The red alert sirens echoed through NASA's Johnson Space Center at 3:47 a.m., piercing the humid Houston night like a knife through silence. In the stark fluorescent glow of mission control, dozens of the nation's brightest aerospace engineers hunched over their workstations, their faces illuminated by cascading error messages that painted their screens in ominous crimson. Sarah Chen, the lead systems engineer, pressed her fingers against her temples as she stared at the satellite telemetry data. The Prometheus 7 communications satellite, humanity's most advanced orbital relay system, had gone completely dark 12 hours ago. Without it, critical military communications, GPS navigation for commercial aviation, and emergency rescue operations across 3 continents would remain crippled. "Status report," barked Director Martinez as he strode into the control room, his usually pristine shirt wrinkled from a sleepless night. "We've tried everything, sir," Sarah replied, her voice strained. "System reboot protocols, emergency frequency shifts, backup power sequences. The satellite's receiving our commands, but something in the primary processing unit isn't responding correctly." The room buzzed with urgent conversations as teams of engineers collaborated across multiple terminals. These weren't just any engineers, they were MIT graduates, Stanford PhDs, the cream of aerospace technology. Yet for 12 hours straight, their combined expertise had yielded nothing but frustration. Antes de continua, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to discover more stories of unsung heroes whose wisdom often goes unnoticed in our high-tech world. Dr. Michael Roberts, the chief technical advisor, wiped sweat from his brow despite the air conditioning. "We've run every diagnostic protocol in our database. The hardware appears functional, but there's some kind of logic error we can't identify. At this rate, we're looking at a complete mission failure." Director Martinez's jaw tightened. A mission failure would mean not just the loss of a $2 billion satellite, but potential national security implications. Commercial flights were already being rerouted, and military operations worldwide were operating on backup systems that hadn't been tested under such prolonged stress. "Sir," interrupted Janet Walsh, a communications specialist, "there's someone here to see you. Says he worked on the original Prometheus project." Martinez frowned. "We don't have time for visitors. He's insisting he can help. Name's Frank Kowalski. Claims he was part of the engineering team 15 years ago." A murmur rippled through the control room. Some of the younger engineers exchanged glances. They'd heard whispers about the old-school engineers who'd built NASA's earlier systems, but most considered them relics of a bygone era. Martinez hesitated, then nodded curtly. 5 minutes. Frank Kowalski shuffled into mission control, wearing faded jeans, steel-toed boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. His weathered hands bore the calluses of someone who'd spent years not just designing systems, but building and fixing them with his own hands. At 68, his gray beard was unkempt, and his thick-rimmed glasses were held together with electrical tape. The contrast was stark. Around him, sleek workstations hummed with the latest processing power, operated by engineers in pressed khakis and designer glasses. Frank looked like he'd wandered in from a construction site. "You Frank Kowalski?" Martinez asked skeptically. "That's right. Worked here from 1987 to 2009. Helped design the core architecture for the first 4 Prometheus satellites." Frank's voice was gravelly, tinged with a Chicago accent that seemed out of place among the polished technical jargon filling the room. Sarah couldn't hide her incredulity. "Sir, with respect, we're dealing with quantum-encrypted communication protocols and adaptive AI systems. The current Prometheus 7 is generations beyond anything from 15 years ago." Frank nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the wall of monitors displaying the satellite's status. "Maybe so, young lady, but sometimes the fanciest car still needs someone who understands how an engine works." The room fell silent, except for the constant hum of computers and the occasional beep of incoming data. Frank stepped closer to the main display, his practiced eye taking in details that others had overlooked. Frank approached the central console with the measured pace of someone who'd learned that rushing often led to mistakes. The younger engineers watched him with a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed skepticism. To them, he represented everything outdated about aerospace engineering, manual calculations, analog thinking, and a stubborn resistance to modern methodologies. "Can you show me the error log from when the problem started?" Frank asked, adjusting his taped glasses. Dr. Roberts pulled up a complex display filled with hexadecimal codes and system timestamps. "As you can see, the primary processing unit stopped responding to our command protocols at exactly 15:47 GMT yesterday. We've isolated the issue to the satellite's decision-making subroutines, but the AI diagnostic systems aren't providing any useful feedback." Frank squinted at the screen, then surprised everyone by chuckling softly. "AI diagnostic systems. Back in my day, we called them error messages, and we actually read them." "Sir, these are error messages," Sarah interjected, her patience wearing thin. "Highly sophisticated diagnostic reports generated by machine learning algorithms designed to predict system failures before they occur." Frank scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Mind if I see the raw telemetry data? Not the processed stuff, just what the satellite's actually sending down." Dr. Roberts exchanged a glance with Sarah. "The raw data is just noise without proper interpretation. That's why we have the diagnostic systems." Humor an old man's. With reluctant keystrokes, Roberts brought up a screen that looked like digital chaos. Streams of numbers, codes, and symbols scrolling past faster than most people could read. The younger engineers turned away, finding the unprocessed data meaningless, but Frank's eyes lit up like he'd found an old friend. "There," he said, pointing to a sequence that appeared every 37 seconds. "See that pattern?" Sarah leaned closer. "It's just standard telemetry housekeeping data, temperature readings, power levels, routine status checks. Look at the timestamp intervals." Frank's finger traced along the screen. "They're not quite regular, are they?" Dr. Roberts frowned, pulling up a more detailed analysis. "There's a 0.003-second variance. That's well within acceptable parameters for system timing. Maybe for your new systems. But the core timing protocol in Prometheus 7 is based on the original architecture I helped design. We built it to synchronize with a specific crystal oscillator frequency." Frank paused, seeing the blank stares around him. "The satellite thinks it's running slower than it actually is." "That's impossible," Sarah protested. "The chronometer systems are quantum precise. They don't drift." Frank nodded patiently. "The chronometers don't drift. But the legacy systems that interpret the chronometer data, they were designed to expect a certain kind of timing signal. When we upgraded to quantum precision, nobody thought to update the interpretation algorithms in the deep core systems." The room fell quiet as the implications sank in. Dr. Roberts ran his hands through his hair. "So the satellite is receiving our commands. But it thinks they're arriving at the wrong time," Frank finished. "So it's rejecting them as potentially corrupted data. Classic fail-safe protocol from the old days." Director Martinez stepped forward. "Can you fix it?" Frank walked to an unused terminal and sat down heavily, his joints protesting years of physical labor. "Mind if I borrow this?" "Sir," Sarah began, "that terminal requires level 7 clearance, and—" "Give him access," Martinez ordered. Frank's weathered fingers moved across the keyboard with surprising agility, though his typing style was methodical rather than fluid. Where the younger engineers relied on complex software interfaces, Frank pulled up command line protocols that most of them had never seen. "The fix is actually pretty simple," he said, not looking up from the screen. "We just need to insert a timing compensation algorithm into the core interpretation system. Basically, we tell the satellite to expect the more precise timing signals." "How long will that take?" Martinez asked. Frank was already typing. "About 3 minutes to write the patch, another 2 to upload it." He paused, glancing around the room, assuming I remember the access codes for the deep system architecture. Dr. Roberts watched in amazement as Frank navigated through system layers that weren't even documented in their current technical manuals. How do you remember all this? Same way you remember how to ride a bike, Frank replied, his fingers still moving. Some things just stick with you. The atmosphere in mission control grew electric as Frank's fingers danced across the keyboard with increasing confidence. What had started as skeptical tolerance from the engineering team was slowly transforming into genuine fascination. Even Sarah found herself leaning over Frank's shoulder, watching as he navigated through system architectures that existed nowhere in their current documentation. "This is the original Prometheus core language," she murmured, recognizing fragments of code from her graduate studies. "We haven't used these protocols in over a decade." "That's the thing about legacy systems," Frank replied, not breaking his concentration. "They don't just disappear when you build something new on top of them. They're still there, buried deep, running the show from behind the scenes." Dr. Roberts monitored the satellite's status on his screen. "Prometheus 7 is still non-responsive. How do we know this approach will work?" Frank paused his typing and turned around. "Dr. Roberts, you've got a PhD in aerospace engineering from where? MIT. "That's correct. And Sarah here, Stanford, right. Probably graduated summa cum laude, wrote a brilliant thesis on quantum communication protocols." Sarah nodded, unsure where this was leading. "I've got a high school diploma from Southside Chicago and 42 years of making things work when they're supposed to be impossible." Frank's eyes crinkled with genuine warmth, not arrogance. "Sometimes experience beats education, sometimes it doesn't. Today, we're about to find out which." He turned back to the terminal. "Timing compensation patch is ready. But before I upload it, I want everyone to understand what we're doing here. Modern engineering tends to add layers of complexity to solve problems. Sometimes, though, the solution is about stripping away the complexity to find what's actually broken." Director Martinez checked his watch. They were approaching the 14-hour mark since the satellite had gone dark. "What's the worst-case scenario if this doesn't work?" "Same place we are now," Frank replied. "Dead satellite, failed mission, and a lot of very smart people wondering what went wrong." He cracked his knuckles. "But if it does work?" "The satellite comes back online immediately?" Sarah asked. Frank shook his head. "Not immediately. The timing compensation will need to propagate through the system. We're looking at maybe 15-20 minutes before we see results. But once it takes hold, everything should start working normally." He looked around the room one more time, meeting the eyes of engineers who were young enough to be his grandchildren. "Anyone have any objections or suggestions before I send this up?" Dr. Roberts reviewed the code on his own screen. "I have to admit, I don't fully understand the approach, but the logic appears sound." "The mathematics check out." "Sarah," Frank asked. Sarah hesitated. Her instinct was to run more simulations, to test the patch in virtual environments, to peer-review the solution through proper channels. But they were out of time, and conventional approaches had already failed. "Do it," she said quietly. Frank nodded and initiated the upload sequence. On screens throughout mission control, technicians watched as the timing compensation algorithm traveled from Earth to the satellite orbiting 22,300 miles above the equator. The upload completed successfully, but Prometheus 7 remained silent. "Now we wait," Frank said, pushing back from the terminal and stretching his back. The waiting was excruciating. Every minute felt like an hour as dozens of NASA's best minds stared at screens that showed no change in the satellite's status. Some engineers tried to stay busy with other tasks, but most found themselves gravitating toward the main display, hoping to see some sign of life from Prometheus 7. 15 minutes, Martinez announced. Frank remained calm, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup that had seen better days. "Sometimes the hardest part isn't fixing the problem," he said to no one in particular. "It's trusting that you fixed it right." At 18 minutes post-upload, A soft chime echoed through mission control. Sarah's workstation showed the first green light they'd seen in 14 hours. "We're getting preliminary telemetry," she called out, her voice tight with controlled excitement. More chimes followed. Across the control room, workstations began displaying normal operational data. Temperature readings, power levels, communication protocols, all returning to expected parameters. "Prometheus 7 is responding to commands," Dr. Roberts announced, unable to keep the amazement out of his voice. Frank stood up slowly, a slight smile creasing his weathered features. Sometimes the most advanced technology needs the oldest wisdom to work. The transformation in mission control was immediate and profound. What had been a room full of frustrated, sleep-deprived engineers suddenly became a celebration of restored confidence and operational success. Prometheus 7 wasn't just responding, it was performing better than it had in months, as if the timing compensation had resolved issues that had been subtly degrading system performance for weeks. "Sir, we're showing full communication capability across all 3 continental networks," reported Janet Walsh, her voice bright with relief. "GPS navigation systems are coming back online, and military channels are requesting immediate reconnection." Director Martinez watched the displays with satisfaction, then turned to Frank, who was quietly packing up the few personal items he'd brought with him. "Mr. Kowalski, I think we need to have a conversation." Frank looked up, adjusting his taped glasses. "About what?" "About how NASA just spent 14 hours with our best engineers, unable to solve a problem that you fixed in 20 minutes. The room had grown quieter, with many of the younger engineers listening while pretending to focus on their workstations. Frank could sense their attention and chose his words carefully. "Director Martinez, your engineers did solve the problem, they just solved it the hard way." Frank gestured toward the banks of sophisticated equipment. "They isolated the failure to the exact right system, they eliminated all the impossible causes, they ran every diagnostic protocol correctly. All I did was recognize a pattern from something I'd seen before." Dr. Roberts looked up from his terminal. "But how did you know to look for timing issues? We ran comprehensive chronometer diagnostics." Frank chuckled, "Because 15 years ago, we had the exact same problem during the Prometheus 4 launch. Took us 3 days to figure it out back then, and we swore we'd document the solution properly." He paused. Apparently, that documentation got lost somewhere along the way. Sarah had been quietly reviewing the system logs. "Mr. Kowalski, I've been looking at our historical records. There's no mention of any timing-related issues with Prometheus 4. "That's because we called it a deep system integration anomaly," Frank replied with a wry smile. "We were young and wanted to sound sophisticated. Sometimes the simplest explanation gets buried under fancy terminology." Martinez crossed his arms. "Frank, I'm going to be direct with you. We need people like you here. You've got people like me here. They're just 20 years younger and have better degrees. But they don't have your experience." Frank sat back down, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "Director, I appreciate the offer, but I retired for a reason. These young folks are brilliant, they really are. They understand things about modern systems that I can barely comprehend. What happened today wasn't about me being smarter than them. It was about me getting lucky." Sarah stepped forward. "Mr. Kowalski, it wasn't luck. You saw a pattern that we missed because we were looking at the problem through the wrong lens." "Maybe so. But tomorrow there'll be a different problem that needs fresh eyes and new thinking." Frank stood up again. "What you folks need isn't more old-timers hanging around. You need better communication between your new systems and your legacy architectures." Dr. Roberts nodded thoughtfully. "He's right. We've been treating the older systems as black boxes. We assume they work without really understanding how they integrate with newer components." "Exactly." Frank pointed to a wall display showing Prometheus 7's restored functionality. "Your satellite is a miracle of modern engineering, but it's built on foundations that were laid decades ago. Sometimes you need to understand the foundation before you can fix the house. Martinez was quiet for a moment, then extended his hand. Frank, would you at least consider serving as a consultant, maybe helping us document some of these legacy system interactions? Frank shook his hand firmly. I'll think about it. But on one condition. What's that? You let these young engineers teach me about the new stuff while I'm explaining the old stuff to them. I've been retired for 5 years, and I'm way behind on quantum communication protocols and AI diagnostics. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in 14 hours. Mr. Kowalski, I'd be happy to trade lessons, quantum protocols for legacy system architecture. Deal, Frank replied, but I still think you folks have everything you need right here. You just need to remember that sometimes the best solution isn't the most complicated one. As Frank gathered his things to leave, several of the younger engineers approached him with questions about other legacy systems. He answered each query patiently, sharing insights that weren't written in any manual but lived only in the memory of someone who'd been there when the systems were born. 3 weeks later, Frank Kowalski found himself standing in the same mission control room, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of crisis and panic, there was an air of collaborative learning. He'd accepted Martinez's consulting offer, but on his own terms, 3 days a week, working directly with the engineering teams to document legacy system interactions and share knowledge that existed nowhere else. The morning briefing is about to start, Sarah Chen called out, approaching with a tablet and a genuinely warm smile. Over the past weeks, she and Frank had developed an unexpected mentoring relationship that benefited both of them. Frank nodded, straightening his new NASA polo shirt, a far cry from the flannel he'd worn during the crisis, but still paired with his familiar jeans and steel-toed boots. What's on the agenda today? Prometheus 8 integration planning. The engineering team wants to review the new design specifications with you before they finalize the legacy system interfaces. They walked toward the conference room where a dozen engineers had gathered around a holographic display showing the planned satellite's architecture. These were some of the same people who had initially viewed Frank with skepticism, but their attitudes had shifted dramatically after witnessing his expertise firsthand. Dr. Roberts looked up as they entered. Frank, perfect timing. We're discussing the core processing unit design for Prometheus 8. Based on what we learned from the Prometheus 7 incident, we want to build better integration protocols from the ground up. Frank studied the holographic schematic, noting how the designers had incorporated lessons from recent experience. This looks impressive. I can see you've built in multiple redundancy layers for timing synchronization. Exactly, said Jennifer Martinez, a recent MIT graduate who had initially been most skeptical of Frank's involvement. We've also created modular interfaces so that legacy systems can be updated or replaced without affecting core functionality. Frank nodded approvingly. That's smart engineering. But can I suggest something? The room fell quiet, not with the skeptical silence of 3 weeks ago, but with the attentive quiet of people who had learned to value his input. Document everything, but also make sure someone understands the why behind each decision. 20 years from now, another group of brilliant engineers is going to inherit this system. Don't make them guess what you were thinking. Sarah made notes on her tablet. We're creating comprehensive technical documentation, but you're talking about something more than that. I'm talking about institutional memory, Frank replied. The kind of knowledge that doesn't fit in manuals, but makes the difference between a system that works and a system that works reliably. Dr. Roberts leaned forward. Frank, can you give us an example? Frank thought for a moment. The Prometheus 7 timing issue. If we just documented that we had a timing problem and how we fixed it, the next generation would have known what to look for. But we called it an integration anomaly and filed it away. The solution got lost because we didn't explain the thinking behind it. Jennifer nodded. So we need to document not just what we did, but why we did it and what we learned from it. Exactly. And more than that, you need to create a culture where it's okay to ask questions about older systems, even if those questions seem basic. The meeting continued for another hour, with Frank providing insights that bridged the gap between cutting-edge innovation and practical experience. But what impressed him most wasn't his own contribution. It was watching how the younger engineers had learned to integrate different types of thinking into their problem-solving approach. After the meeting, Frank found himself walking through the halls of Johnson Space Center with Sarah, past displays showcasing decades of space exploration achievements. The walls told stories of triumph and failure, of bold innovations and hard-learned lessons. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" Frank said as they paused in front of a display about the Apollo program. "Of course. 3 weeks ago, you thought I was a relic who didn't understand modern systems. What changed your mind?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I realized I was making the same mistake I'd been trained to avoid as an engineer. I was making assumptions without gathering data. I assumed that newer always meant better, and that experience with older systems wasn't relevant to current challenges. And now I understand that engineering isn't just about knowing the latest technology. It's about understanding how systems work together, how they fail, and how to fix them when they do. That kind of knowledge doesn't have an expiration date." Frank smiled. "You know what I learned from working with you folks?" "What's that?" "That the future of engineering isn't about old versus new. It's about combining the best of both. Your generation brings innovation and fresh thinking that I could never match. My generation brings experience and perspective that can't be taught in textbooks." They reached the parking lot, where Frank's weathered pickup truck sat next to Sarah's sleek hybrid sedan, a perfect metaphor for their collaboration. "Frank," Sarah said as they prepared to part ways, "thank you for teaching us that sometimes the most sophisticated problems have surprisingly simple solutions." Frank climbed into his truck and rolled down the window. "And thank you for teaching an old dog some new tricks. Quantum communication protocols are actually pretty fascinating once you get